some indications early on that were not really recognized by any one part of the search effort, that there was something going on in the Grand Canyon area. There was a visitor from Williams, which is a town just over to the west of Flagstaff, that was at a desert view out here east of where we are right now, at the watchtower that reported seeing some smoke shortly after the time that these two planes were supposed to have reported in. And there was also a little Navajo girl out on the Navajo reservation who reported seeing the same kind of smoke in the same general area. Two pilots for Grand Canyon Airlines, Henry and Palin Hudgen, operated the original Grand Canyon airline out of a little airfield out at Red Butte back in those days. If you came up on the highway from Flagstaff, you would have seen that just past Valley. It's the big Red Butte there off to your right. And as they did in the summer months back in those days, it was a seasonal business. They operated out of Tucson in the winter and the Grand Canyon area in the summer. They were flying people out on sightseeing tours, just like happens every day today at the Grand Canyon. And they had noticed some smoke out over the canyon, but with the monsoon season, with the thunderstorms kicking in, they had assumed that it was a lightning strike fire probably at first. I talked to their son a while back, and he said the smoke looked a little darker, a little bit more than you would expect from a lightning strike usually, but it just wasn't really anything that immediately grabbed your attention, except as some possible little brush fire. Now, when they got back to their aerodrome in the evening and turned on the evening radio news, they heard about the two missing aircraft. And here, we can, just to back up a second, you can see why the search area was off. The little rectangle up here is where the actual crash occurred and where the wreckage was later found, and you can see where those red and blue lines cross, that they were a ways apart. And Henry and Palin, once they got back, they started thinking about this crash. They thought, you know, we saw that smoke. We ought to go take a look, see if that has anything to do with it. And they flew back out just before sunset, and they were actually able to identify the remains of the TWA aircraft. As you can see over here in these pictures, I'll see if I can do this without blinding Richard here. It has a very distinctive triple tail, the TWA Super Constellation does. And that tail ended up almost intact, a short distance away from the main impact site. And so when Henry and Palin went out flying that evening, they saw two areas of wreckage, and they saw this intact tail, so they knew that they'd found the right place. Their son the son of Palin told me that the phone line that they had one phone line that ran on top of the ground 14 miles to the ranger station here at Grand Canyon Village, was often knocked out by lightning strikes or cattle or who knew what. He said that was one of his regular childhood chores, was going out and figuring where the break in this line was and repairing it. And on that day, like a lot of other days, that phone line was down. So the brothers got in their truck and they drove out here to the village, to the ranger station. And they got on a phone and they called back to TWA to try and report that they'd found their aircraft. And they said that they had the hardest time getting through, and they had a pretty hard time being believed initially, because there were all sorts of people calling in from all over the country reporting sightings or psychic premonitions or things like that about where these aircraft were. But they were eventually able to convince the folks that they were pilots, they knew what they were talking about, and that they'd found their aircraft. The following morning, July 1st, 1956, on Sunday morning, was the first day of the new month, and the folks all around the world that had TWA calendars, which was a big promotional item that they passed out thousands of copies of, turned over their calendar to the new month, and this is the picture that they saw, the Grand Canyon with the TWA Super Constellation. These are the crash sites. This is looking basically almost straight south in the direction of eventually, if you were to follow it on down the watchtower at Desert View, it's up this way. Actually, a little more this way. This is the Colorado River. This is the direction that it flows. Downstream is that way. In TWA, the wreck site was right over here on the bottom of Temple Butte, which is this big view here. And the main wreck site was about here. The tail was a little further over here. United, there was another area of wreckage that was later identified as the United wreck site, and that was actually on a cliff, basically on a cliff face, which is facing, the cliff faces back over this way. It's on the back side from this picture. And the United plane, the main impact was about 10 feet below the bottom of this, or the top of this cliff face, rather. Some of the wreckage had shot over the top. Most of it had spilled down in front of it. The head investigator, the head of the CAB's investigative team at that time, was a guy named Bill Andrews. He was a very interesting guy in his own right, like some of the folks that our Bill here had talked about, had been involved in aircraft, aviation practically since day one. He was a genuine World War I flying ace. He flew with the Lafayette Escadrille in World War I, and he'd been investigating crashes for a number of years at this point. He had a success rate at figuring out what had caused aircraft to crash somewhere in the 90% range, and he was known as the J. Edgar Hoover of the air in those days. This is an aerial view taken from a helicopter of the sandbar, and these are some of the folks that were landed on that sandbar by helicopter. Military helicopters landed these folks, a combination of military paramedics, which I found out in the course of researching this actually started as literally a contraction of parachute medics. These guys were trained to parachute if need be out of aircraft and provide medical aid. And so these folks in this picture here are a combination of Army paramedics and representatives from the airlines and the Airline Pilots Association, the Airline Pilots Union, basically. And then local government officials as well. This guy in the cowboy hat here was the Coconino County coroner out of Flagstaff. These folks parachuted in here, or actually didn't have to parachute. They were dropped in on that sandbar and then waded across the shallow part of the Colorado River onto the bottom of Temple Butte and were able to hike up to the TWA crash site. And this is a picture of them in the heat, which was up into the 120s down at the bottom of the canyon at that time of year in 1956. And these are some of the body bags they brought in to retrieve the remains, the personal effects, and the mail was the other thing that they were asked to retrieve from this crash. The conditions in the canyon in the beginning of July 1956 were pretty horrendous. 120-degree temperatures, like I said, huge updrafts and downdrafts, and among other things, a swarm of small aircraft from media representatives from all over the country. As soon as they heard that these aircraft were missing and later were down, they started chartering aircraft, and there were dozens of them at times circling over the canyon. And they had, in this first morning of the recovery, they actually had a near collision between two of these aircraft. And the flying air traffic controller, one of the military aircraft, had a guy on the radio trying to organize this chaos overhead. He said, "That's enough, we're done flying." So all of these guys here were stranded down in the canyon that first night. And some of them had sleeping bags, a lot of them didn't. They ended up actually sleeping in the body bags that they had brought down.